Snow sifted from a soft gray sky as two shadows crossed the pale expanse north of the Wolfswood, a great winged pair that shuddered the air with every beat. Winterfell lay below, its towers and walls clutched tight by ice, its hot springs smoking like the breath of a hidden giant. Hounds barked once and then thought better of it. The guards on the battlements raised their shields out of instinct more than sense. They could no more stop those shapes than they could wind or time. The smaller shadow tilted, scarlet membranes cutting the cold light. The larger sank into a widening spiral, black and vast as a moonless night. The old gods' faces in the weirwood grove watched without blinking, those carved red eyes fixed upon the field of settling ash that was not ash at all, only snow that fell in patient, soundless flurries. Drogon landed first, the stones of the outer yard booming beneath his weight. His talons scraped frost and gouged it into curling shards. Rhaegal came second, sliding half a body length with the unsteady pride of a creature that had forgotten what it was to be small. Men flinched. Women stopped where they were. The steam huffed up around the dragon's shoulders, wreathed them like a coronation. Above Drogon's spine, Daenerys Targaryen uncurled herself from the saddle she had lashed from Essosi leathers and Northman furs. She swung down with a hiss, cold bit through even to her bones. Her breath fogged in a long plume, and she tasted iron in the air. The metal of Winterfell's heart, an old thing that had outlasted much and was not impressed. She stepped away from Drogon, laid a gloved hand to the black scales where warmth pooled beneath the armor, and then looked to the great open gate. Sansa Stark stood within the shadow of the archway, hair the color of sunrise over a frozen lake, heightened by a mantle of white furs. Ghost stood with her, as white as the ground, eyes red as a coal bed. "Welcome," Sansa said, voice even, "to Winterfell. It was yours before it was mine to ask for," Daenerys answered. She pulled the hood back from her silver hair, snow hatching it in fine streaks. "I have come to swear that I will not take it from you. I hope for more than that. I hope for a new thing to be made here." Jon stood to Sansa's left, face flagged by windburn and uncertainty. He had ridden ahead of her weeks ago with ravens telling of dead things moving through the trees. Ravens telling, too, of Daenerys, her army, and her two dragons. He had the look of a man stranded between tides. When Daenerys' eyes found him, she allowed herself the smallest smile, and then let it go. They convened in the great hall when the dragons had settled along the warmest flank of the bailey. One giant spine pressed to the steaming stones above the crypts. The tables stood at angles, chairs dragged from hearths and corners. The ground slushed where snow had melted and refrozen. The long banners showed dark wolves running. The air hummed with a hard unease. "The Dead March," Daenerys said once the first uneasy pleasantries were done. Words falling into the fire crackle and cutlery scrape, and the way the North always listened with its jaw clenched. "We will line this castle with dragonglass. We will make trenches of fire beyond the winter town, lines of them. The dragons will keep watch. The Dothraki will ride out with scouts and freeze while we learn how to keep them from freezing. The Unsullied will hold the walls. The free folk know the snows better than we do. They will be our eyes in the trees and our hands when the cold eats any softness we have left." "You speak as if you have already taken command," said Lord Wyman Manderly, voice heavy but not unkind. "We fought for our own kings once. We die for our own lords. I am not here to take your lives into my pocket," Daenerys replied. "I am here because I mean to live, and I mean for you to live also. My dragons breathe fire. That matters against what comes. I have soldiers. That matters. I have ships if we need to break and run, but I did not come to run." Sansa's eyes did not leave Daenerys' face. "If we live, your eye will turn south again," she said. "To a throne men died by the thousand to claim. I must know now whether Winterfell is merely a pit stop in your war, or you truly mean to make it something else." "Why Winterfell?" asked Lyanna Mormont, small in her chair, spine unyielding iron. "Why not your city on the sea? Why bring dragons to our roofs and make our little ones peep through shutters to their shadows when the sun slips?" "Because the world has turned," Daenerys said. She did not pull her voice into softness. She let it stand with its edges. The doom we feared rides from the north. Power was built in summer on green fields and beneath red tiles. It broke. If we live, the age that follows will need a new heart where fire and cold meet. Your springs run hot beneath your stones even when the air scours our teeth. Dragons like steam, wolves like winter, I would have both strong. I would make a seat here that no dead thing can ever claim again. Jon's gaze flickered then, a spark inside eyes gone winter dark. A northern court with dragonfire in its chimneys, he said as if tasting the words. And what name would you give it? Daenerys looked to the rafters, where ancient soot had grown a skin over oaken beams. She was a child in a house that had burned. She was a woman in a hall that had withstood the grinding of many winters. The hearth of the north, she said. Sansa set her hands on the table. Winterfell is not yours to rename. It isn't, Daenerys allowed. But I will build something that is. A ring of towers beyond your wall. A rookery for dragons where their heat feeds your baths, and your baths feed their sleep. A forge where dragonglass turns to arrowheads and spear tips and swords as quickly as water turns to ice in the night. I would build a school here as I meant to build in Meereen, but this time for smiths and healers and readers of old texts, Northmen and Southron and freedmen who choose cold for the promise of shelter. Men of the Iron Islands have sent word through Yara. They will bring timber. The Dornish will send vines and seeds that drink heat. The Reach, if it can still remember its soul, will send grain north to plant when the storms end. You would summon the South to our snow with promises and plans, Sansa said, and for a heartbeat there was approval hiding under her caution. The South is promises and plans. The South is a wound, Daenerys said, and did not look at Jon when she said it. I intend to let it scab over while we live through this. After, if after comes, then we will speak of who wears what crown. After, Jon murmured, and his breath left his body like an admission. If after comes. On the yard, the dragons tested the steam with their tongues, tasting the warmth that rose like an old god's secret. Children peered from doorways. Regal nosed the gable of a stable and made the winter-cracked wood creak. Drogon placed one talon over the grating where the springs vented and lay his belly across it, a cat claiming a hearthstone. He was too large to be anything but monstrous, yet in that moment some of the watchers saw tenderness in the arch of his spine, and their fear resettled into wary awe. The first days were a hammer's rhythm. Jon and Daenerys rode out beyond the brewing trenches into the winter town, where half the homes were shuttered and drift-buried and the other half were braced for strangers. Daenerys had tents erected along the runoff from the springs. The snow turned to slush where the water touched, to ice again when the wind overhead chased heat as a starving dog chases bone. She had the unsullied form work lines and the free folk lash saplings into sledges. They dragged chunks of dragonglass from a river barge as if dragging night from a hole. Gendry Baratheon hammered in the forges beneath the armorer's roof until his skin shone with a summer only he could feel. You ever thought to make a mold? Gendry asked when Daenerys stood in that sharp winter light and watched him sweat the glass into a shape that would hold an edge. For arrows, for spearheads, something so you could pour 10 and have 10 come out near enough the twin of the first. His eyes flicked to her and then away again. When my father had a hammer, he thought everything was a nail. I could be the same if I'm not careful. Make them, she said. Make 10. Make 100. Store them where the heat won't warp them and the cold won't crack them. We will need them in such numbers the counting will sour the counters. I never much liked counting, Gendry said, showing teeth like a boy, and then dropped the molten glass into a basin with a hiss like a serpent dying. In the Godswood, Bran Stark sat beneath the red leaves and watched crows spin their midnight coins across the pale sky. Arya found him there and crouched close enough to see her own breath meet his in a little clouded dance. She means it, Arya said after a time, to make it here, to stay. Bran's eyes did not move. The river doesn't mean to become ice, he said. It simply does when the air does what it does. He tilted his head in a way that did not belong to a boy. She will try to keep the river moving. It will freeze around her in places. It will flood in others. And then the sun will come, and we will call it all intention. Arya smiled because sometimes Bran said things that were like riddles wrapped around stones. If it freezes around her, she said, someone should teach her how to walk on ice. Drogon knows, Bran said. He knows the hot earth under him. He will learn the cold air on his teeth. The dead do not learn. Arya's hand slid to the hilt by her hip. She had brought a blade home from a southern city that stank of tar, and it was lighter than any sword forged this side of the narrow sea. Then we will teach them. When Davos Seaworth told Daenerys that winter towns could be bribed with warmth more surely than gold, she listened. He had a way of talking that sounded like a man rolling small stones in his palm, weighing them. You give folk heat, your grace, Davos said, and they'll forgive a deal of dragon. You give them work and a wage to buy a pot, and they'll forgive the rest. You put food in that pot, you'll have them calling your name when they've got all their teeth. What do you ask in return for giving me this wisdom? Daenerys asked, half grave and half amused. Only that you live long enough to owe me, Davos said. It's more interesting that way. They cut the first of the fire trenches in a crooked lattice around Winterfell's outer fields, rough squares where wagons had once turned with harvest. The trenches filled with oil and pitch and a mixture of rendered fat that stuck to anything it kissed. Dothraki riders scoured the edges of the bar rollins and returned with sacks heavy with strange things. Resinous knots from evergreens, cones that bled amber tears. Missandei organized stores and hands and the sustained miracle by which 1,000 mouths do not starve when they feel they must. Jon watched all of this with a face that moved between attention and a distance that looked like a wound. At night, on the wall above the godswood, they spoke quietly where the wind had room to carry the sound to nobody but trees. Why Winterfell? He asked her then. Once there was no hall to hear them, no lords to parse political sinew from bone. Truly, the words you spoke were good words. They sit well in the air and make sense. But why? Daenerys rested her forearms along the top of the stone, fingertips wet where snow had turned to damp. Beyond the wall, the white world extended under the thin moon like a pelt stretched on a frame. Because I am tired of burning down houses that scorn me, she said at last. I want to build where I am scorned, and then see if the house changes or if I do. Because I dream of a room where it is warm and there are no masters and no iron rings hidden in the floor. Because if I make that room in King's Landing first, it will smell of blood from the start and never air out. Because Winterfell has held and held and held, and it deserves to be something other than the place people run to before they die. She turned to him. Because we are here. He took that in like a man who had come upon an answer when he had been looking for a different one. If we live, he said. If we live, she agreed, not flinching from the truth that lay in the words like a blade on a table. The dead came slowly at first like rumor. Free folk sent a woman back with eyes that would not focus, who knelt before Sansa and laid down a bundle of wet black feathers and said, "The birds fall when the wind turns cold enough. They fall as if shot. They lie on the snow like dropped coins." A boy, 12 maybe, stumbled through the gates 2 nights later with a face half pearled with frostbite and spoke of the shadows that moved without wind. The first column of cold things they saw themselves came when the moon was a thin white tooth over the castle and the wolves would not lift their heads from their paws. The sentries beat the bells. The trenches went up with a sound that was less a roar than a great inhalation, the oil catching in a slick rush. Snow hissed. Dark shapes paused at the fire's edge and moved sideways, patient. Daenerys rose from her narrow bed and tied her furs at her throat as if dressing for a dance. Drogon came from the yard like a storm, black in black sky, his belly bright where the springs had heated him, his great heart pounding so hard that Daenerys felt it under her thighs as she settled the straps. Regal took off in a tumble that he corrected with a sweep of shoulders that sent snow devils spinning. On the southern wall, archers dipped dragonglass arrowheads into pitch and lit them like candles. They twanged and whistled and made small constellations of brief orange. The dead moved like a tide against a jetty. Press, pause, flow, scenting for a place to pour through. She learned quickly the language of cold air, of heat's reluctance in a northern sky. Fire behaved differently here. Dragon flame met night and made it peel like bark. But then the world drank the after and left a small, mean shadow of the great blaze. She learned to time the breath so that the trench caught at once and then other flames were left by other hands, not riding her dragons to exhaustion. She learned what it was to hear the screaming that was not human but had a shape in it nevertheless, a pattern like glass shattering, and to feel pity for a heartbeat and then not waste her life on pity. Jon fought where the wall dipped near the southern postern. He moved like something the wind had carved out of ice and set in motion. He had always been a good sword. He was better now. He flanked men who did not yet know they had left their flanks. He retreated when it was time to retreat, and the men who loved to call someone else coward retreated with him because they loved him more. When he looked up and saw Daenerys pass overhead, Drogon's throat pouring bright gold down into the trench, the thought that filled him was not, "She is a queen," or "She is a dragon rider." It was, "She has chosen us." He held the thought close like a coal in his glove. Days bled into each other without color. They ate and slept in shifts, learned to pee where the wind would not slap it back into their boots, learned to run without sweating and to stand still without freezing. The dead tested the lines and were burned back and tested again. Missandei taught the north a word from Nathi that meant the calm of a shallow sea. Not safe, but quiet. The castle filled with small miracles. A baby was born in the armory to a woman who had not known she was pregnant until her labor started. The child came out pink and wailing and stubborn, and Davos said he had never loved noise so much as he loved that cry. Gendry's molds poured true, quivers filled with arrows that cleaved the night. Sansa called councils where free folk and Ironborn spoke and bickered and stormed from the room and came back soothed because Missandei had gone to find them and told them stories about heat and kindness. Daenerys sent riders far south with letters folded into oilskin. She asked for grain, for smiths, for builders who were tired of building kings' tombs and wanted to build something that breathed. She sent letters to Old Town that promised a place for their quiet hunger for knowledge. She sent a letter to Casterly Rock that spoke of debts not paid in gold. The ravens came back heavy with answers or empty with sky. Enough came back with yes to make the work seem real. She walked the crypts at dawn before the day's orders were given, breath clouding, footfalls echoing in that damp, forgiving dark. Jon found her there once in front of Lyanna Stark's statue. The woman's stone eyes watched with the unnerving certainty of someone who had lost everything and somehow managed to leave a blessing behind. "There are names below winter," Daenerys said. "Names holding the roof up. I never had a tomb to visit that was legitimate. My father is ash. My mother is a story told in whispers. My brother is a ghost that lingers where I least want him. I think sometimes that this is why I want to build a house. So there will be something to hold the roof up when I am gone. A place that says, she existed, not because of a throne, because of a hearth." Jon's mouth shaped around something and then let it sit on his tongue. "You exist," he said, and then touched her wrist as if reminding himself that heat still lived in people. "Sansa will not bend to you. She will work with you. She will not bend." "I did not come to bend her," Daenerys said. "I will not ask what she cannot give. I will ask what she can." She lifted her eyes to his. "What can you give me?" "Jon Snow." "Myself," he said, and the truth of that frightened neither of them. "What comes with me now is complicated." She laughed, and it came out strangely raw. "Everything that matters is." She lifted his hand. "Then give me the complicated thing. We will set it near the fire and see if it warms or smokes." In the fourth week of testing and setting and shivering, a storm rose from the east like a curtain drawn fast. The sky vanished. The world was reduced to 10 paces of visibility and the roar of snow. The dead came then, because sometimes the story wants to make its point loudly. Bells were useless. The air ate their sound. Flaming arrows sputtered in gusts that treated fire like a leaf. The pummeling white grounded the dragons, who could not climb out of it. Daenerys walked, then ran between one line and the next, her cloak a flag that pulled men with it. She set torches herself to the trench in 3 places when lads with red fingers could not make flint behave. She pushed a boy toward a tower door with so much force he fell and looked back horrified until he saw her face and then remembered that orders were sometimes love with its teeth bared. Jon's world slowed and sharpened. He cut and his arms were iron strapped to meat. He lost his footing and hit hard, and the dead above him came in a black snow of claws and ancient blade. And then Drogon's head was there, as if the wind had opened a slit just wide enough to let him pass. Fire did not behave in the storm. It muscled out and then collapsed, but the heat bought Jon an elbow's worth of time. He rolled, stabbed upward, a blow that cracked old ice like a knuckle. The thing that had been a man shattered into those impossible shards. Drogon rose, tail lashing, and was gone again into weather. At dawn, the storm snapped like a rotten sail. The trenches smoldered. Men looked at one another with the shock of those who have survived. The snow for 100 yards beyond the lines was gray with ash and black with night turned tangible. Daenerys stood on the southern wall, her hair a snarl that did not know what to do without dragon flames curing heat, and she put her hand on Sansa's shoulder. Sansa did not shake it off. "You were where you needed to be," Sansa said. "I saw you. We would have lost the South Gate without you." "You were where I could not be," Daenerys answered. "We would have lost the stores if you had not been there to move men like chess pieces." Sansa tilted her head. "Perhaps we are a house where two women know where they need to be. Perhaps we are." They built in the storm's wake as if rewarded for living with a deeper appetite. The first of the new towers began as a ring of stone set away from the eastern curtain where the ground had been hardest packed with old winter. The masons cursed the cold until they learned to warm their tools by laying them near the vents where the springs let out, to work in shifts like soldiers. They laid the chimney first, a thick, straight throat from the hottest pocket of the springs up through the tower's belly to a crown of carved mouths. "So the heat can go out when we want it," the master mason said, "and fall back when we don't." Pods of small rooms clustered around that throat like animals around a watering hole. Barracks for the builders, then space for a forge. Gendry raised a hammer there and discovered that the rap of steel on anvil and the heartbeat of a dragon's belly heat made a rhythm that would carry men through whole days without thinking of the quiet under the snow. Daenerys named that tower the Airy Fire, and when Sansa arched a brow, she shrugged. "I like the word," she said. "It tastes of stone and flight." "Words can be places men live," Sansa said. "Build me a second tower and let me name it." Daenerys smiled. "Done." The Unsullied learned where to stand to keep their bare hands from splitting and bleeding. Grey Worm learned to turn a northern curse so that it landed in the ear like a familiar song. The Dothraki would not be closed inside the castle for more than 2 hours at a time. They rode circles around it like moths about a candle, and when they came in they smelled of leather and storm and a pride that would not bow to anyone's god. Missandei began to keep a book of the names of those who died, written with a loyalty that did not let the hand hurry. Someone needed to count and to witness and to make it clear that the living were not walking across corpses without knowing. Jon brought Bran to the Tower of Builders one afternoon when the snow lay thin and the wind was sleeping. Bran's eyes looked farther than the stones. He put his palm against the tower's skin, as if he were a boy meeting a horse that needed convincing to accept a rider. "It will hold," he said. "You see it," Daenerys said softly. She had come without attendants, hair plaited and tunneled through to keep off the cold. "You see farther than the walls. I have learned to trust those who see beyond me." "I see paths," Bran said, "not fates." He looked to Drogon where the dragon hunched, wing half spread to drink the day's weak heat. "He is thinking of the sea." Daenerys laughed. "Drogon thinks of eating and of killing if something needs killing and of sleeping. He thinks of the underside of clouds and the taste of salt when there is salt. He thinks of nothing at all most of the time. He thinks of how he will carry something heavy," Bran said, and his voice changed in a way that tasted like the air before lightning. "He thinks of the sky with a weight in it that he will not drop." Daenerys felt a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. "I will not ask you how you know that," she said. "I have learned that some questions break more eggs than the answers feed." The second tower rose at the west, where the light died last. Sansa named it Hearthguard. The third began as a rib of stone and then found its shape, warm water, for its channels that fed half a dozen steaming basins built into its lower floor. The dragons liked warm water best. Regal would coil around it and sigh in a way that made men glance over their shoulders as if a story had just walked into the yard. Ravens came in and went out. Yara's ships dragged trees from island shores and dumped them like offerings on white beaches north of White Harbor where the snow thinned. Ironborn stood with Northmen and swore at knots together while they bound sledges and hauled timber inland. Old Town sent a sour-faced maester with a ring that glittered. He announced himself as Maester Coleman and made himself useful in the way of men who dislike admitting it. "If you insist on making a library in a place where books go to die from damp," he said, "then you must keep a room dry as bone. The heat will warp and crack things. You will need a slow dry, faithful dry. We will make it." He did. The first crate of books from south of the Neck arrived with a note in an elegant hand that Missandei read aloud. A lady of the Reach wrote, "I hear your promise. I have kept these from mice and fire. Keep them from frost." When the dead came in earnest, it was not a siege in the old sense. It was a tide that had decided finally the time for patience had passed. The sky was a clean blue knife. The wind came off the distant sea so that the cold smelled briefly of salt, and then that scent went to earth and was gone. The first wave broke on the trenches and hissed and fell to ash. The second found a place where the oil had been used and not refilled and surged. The third hit the walls and climbed like ants, and arrows punched them to powder and men shoved at them with spears and burned their hands even with gloves on because heat and cold confuse each other up here. Daenerys took Drogon high and learned how much higher she could not go without losing feeling in her face. Regal flew lower and fought the instinct to snap at shapes on the walls that moved like prey. Jon anchored the southern angle again, a stubborn habit of his that Sansa wanted to slap and could not because it is hard to slap a man who makes a wall stand where it would rather fall. Arya moved in the broken spaces between one line and the next, and sometimes the only proof she had been there at all was a drift's collapse where a white had fallen into it. On the third day, the Night King came. The air did something then, went still at the edges while the center of the yard filled with a clever wind that blew no one's hair yet made their teeth ache. He did not run. He did not swagger. He merely was, and that was an insult to everything alive. He came with white walkers who moved like hunger had learned to shape itself into men. The first of them stepped into the fire trench and the flame shrank from him. He took the field as if it were an old duty. The second met Grey Worm at a point where stones had been loosened by thaw and hammer. Grey Worm fought him without glory and with terrible, precise economy. When Grey Worm fell to one knee and then rose again because the world asked him to, Missandei watched and did not pray, because she had learned that some prayers are too small and cruel for a day like this. Drogon and Regal struck, and the Night King lifted his hand, and the dragons banked hard with a sound like sails tearing. He stood below them as if he himself were a tower, and Daenerys understood with a clarity that hurt. This is not a thing that wind and heat will move simply. It is a thing made of decision. Her dragons were decisions too. She put her hand on Drogon's neck, and he turned once in a slow, dangerous circle as if seeking where the air was most offended. Jon cut down a white and then another and saw the Night King's face the way the moon appears when clouds open, clean and distant as cold iron. He took 2 steps before the press of the living shoved him, and he pushed back and took 2 more. He had a sword that had killed a White Walker before and remembered doing it, remembered the shock in his arm. He could barely feel his arms now. He could feel the idea of them. That had to be enough. The world narrowed. Regal cried out, and the sound was not music. Drogon's chest swelled, brightened, narrowed again. The Night King lifted his spear, and in the instant before he cast it, Bran, who had not moved from the Godswood, closed his eyes and opened them again somewhere far above, where ravens were a black cloud in sight was something larger than seeing. Drogon did not dive. He climbed, and that climb brought him into the path the spear would have taken had it been thrown to meet another line. It rose under him and scraped scales with a sound no one heard, deflected just enough that it bit the sky and not flesh. Regal, lower, took the wound that the deflection made possible, a greedy mouthful torn from the membrane of his wing. He screamed and dropped like a boulder and then beat upward with a useless, brave insistence. Daenerys saw Jon's face between helms and smoke. He looked like a man trying to climb inside a knife. She saw the dead piling. She saw Sansa on the inner wall, signaling with a flag toward the western work line where they were nearly eaten. She saw Missandei with ink on her fingers because she had been writing a name and had not had time to put the pen down before the bells. She saw Bran's stillness in the godswood like a black gem in red leaves. She made a decision. "Down," she said to Drogon, and he rolled and took the fall like a prince who trusts the ground will catch him. They smashed into the yard ahead of Jon and the Night King both, snow exploding into glitter around them. Daenerys did not wait. She jumped early and hit awkwardly, and her knee sang bright pain up her side. She limped forward with a dragonglass spear she had taken that morning, as if she had been waiting to do exactly this. The Night King turned his head. It was not curiosity. It was the recognition one weapon gives to another. He stepped toward her. "Yo." And found himself free of bodies because men who had been between him and Daenerys moved without being told. He ran. Drogon's wing jutted like a wall. Jon slid under it and came up where flame had baked the snow to a dirty glass. Daenerys thrust, and the Night King lifted one pale blade and parried, and the spear skated along something that was not armor and not flesh. He could have cut her in two with the backhand. He did not. He pressed and pressed again and seemed to be listening to a music only he could hear, one that would tell him when the pleasure of toying ended and the work ought to begin. Jon came to the Night King's left and swung. The Night King turned, let the blade pass, caught it between hands that should not have been able to catch such a thing without blood. Frost climbed the steel. Jon tore it free and the frost went to powder. Daenerys thrust again. The spear point skidded along ribs. The Night King lifted his hand and the air around Daenerys' throat tightened. A collar of winter. The collar broke with a thunderclap. The sound was not heard so much as felt. Teeth jangling, bones ticking in their sockets. Regal, bleeding but not bowed, had thrown his body into the Night King's flank like a dog into a stag. The Night King staggered one pace. It was enough. Jon's sword came down. Daenerys' spear came up. The spear met that cold in the joint of the Night King's breastbone and throat. It bit. The blade came down across the spear's butt and drove it deeper with a shock that slammed Jon's elbows. The Night King's face did not change. He had nothing to change it with, but something in the air behind his eyes did. He reached and found he had no time to close his hand. The shatter was a noise that never truly stopped. It went on underneath the next hour, and the next like a new river under snow. The White Walkers broke like the core of a glacier giving way. The dead crumpled where they stood and settled into snow with the humility of things that had never belonged above ground to start with. Men who had been fighting with their knuckles and their anger found they were swinging at nothing and that their arms, when asked to stop, were not sure how. Silence came in pieces. Someone laughed and nearly sobbed himself into shame. Someone else sat down in a drift and realized it was a corpse's shoulder and moved as quickly as a child. The living gathered themselves to count. They did not chant. They did not lift their weapons. They stood and breathed. Daenerys wiped her face with the back of her glove and found it wet not with tears but with melted snow. Jon leaned on his sword and monitored the trembling of his knees with grim, almost clinical attention, as if he were his own squire and not an exhausted man. Regal folded his injured wing and made a sound dug from deep in his body that said both pain and pride. Drogon bent his head to Daenerys' shoulder and huffed hard enough to push her one step. Sansa descended from the inner wall and came across the yard with her furs dragging like the wake of a small ship. She did not stop with courtesy. She stepped to Daenerys and put her hands on the other woman's shoulders and then, after a breath, pulled her close, forehead to forehead. Two women who had carried houses through storm and fire stood like that, a heartbeat longer than anyone expected. "You built the trenches," Sansa said. "You insisted we keep them filled. You put fire where Winter thought no fire could live. You held the stores," Daenerys said. "You set men properly. You did not let anyone choose death when life was merely difficult." Sansa smiled with the tiredness of someone who had seen too many dawns and wonders whether this one is worth the name. "We will be terrible friends," she said, "but we will be good allies." "That will do," Daenerys said, and looked over Sansa's shoulder toward the towers they had begun. "We will need to rebuild. We will need to plant. We will need to feed the dragons," Sansa said easily, as if talking about hounds. "They feed themselves," Daenerys said, and then amended. "They will need pens to keep them out of the worst of the storms. They will need their own smoke." "Then we will build them their smoke," Sansa said. The days that followed lived in the strange bright hush after the end of a terror. The dead lay where they had fallen until pyres rose and the air tasted of iron in a way that meant grief and not war. Ravens went south with the single sentence that would change so much. The Night King is gone. Those who had waited for night to finish its work began at last to talk of spring again, but with the knowledge that spring is a labor and not a gift. Daenerys wrote south less of grain and more of people. She wrote to Dorne of glasshouses heated by Winterfell springs where their fruit might climb in coils and be harvested under snow. She wrote to the Iron Bank with a promise. Invest in stone and steam and the North will pay you back in centuries of rent, not in coins from a single sack. She set Grey Worm to drill not to clamor for war but to make peace hold. Posts at the roads, orders for disputes, the dull, essential grind of order that she had once despised because it was not a dragon's roar. It did not take her long to learn to love it because it kept children warm. Jon went to the God's Wood alone one morning when the sky was the pale of a new bruise. He knelt. He did not pray. He thought of names. He thought of how a man is made of them, the ones given and the ones earned, and how they sit on his shoulders like a set of cloaks that sometimes tangle the sword arm. He thought of his father and the man who had been his father. He thought of his mother. He thought of duty as a road that does not always lead where you believed it would. The snow on the weirwood's leaves was like milk. When he rose, he had the kind of decision in him that feels like a little clear bell struck once and then allowed to ring until it has rung itself. He found Daenerys at the worksite of the fourth tower. She had a piece of chalk in one hand and was drawing a pattern on stone, a giant spiral that would collect heat and spill it slowly. Her hair had come loose so that strands had flown and frozen and then thawed into small watery commas curled against her neck. "I would like to stand with you," he said. He did not present the words as fealty. He presented them as truth. Not as your secret, not as your subordinate, as your equal if you'll have it, or as your lesser if you require it, but standing. Here. She looked at him in the way she had looked at the dragons when they were small, and she had been afraid to love them too much because the loving seemed like the surest way of inviting the world to take them. "Here," she said, "not in King's Landing. Here," he said. He looked toward the south the way a man looks at a road he has walked and found he does not much care to walk again. The South will have to learn to take care of itself. If it cannot, perhaps it is not meant to be saved. Perhaps it needs to be frightened into being kinder. Perhaps we will frighten it by thriving, Daenerys said. Perhaps this place will make the South envious. People will call envy many better names. They will call it aspiration. They will call it joining. Jon smiled. "You do not plan to march south with dragons." "I plan to build a road from south to north and make it so pleasant to travel they come without being commanded," she said. "We have steam. We will make baths. We will make light that burns without smoke. We will make glass that holds gardens." "You talk like a maester," Jon said, and it was not an insult. "I talk like someone who is tired of winning battles that give nothing back but graves." They stood together beside the half-made tower and imagined a heat engine none of their ancestors would have believed could exist. Spring in the north does not arrive on a particular day. It seeps. The sky has a different shade of blue for a week and then relapses. The snow remembers what water feels like. The smell of rot rises as a promise, not a curse. Women who have had their babies tied off their guts to keep the cold from getting in untie them. Men stand longer in the yard before going inside because the wind is interrogating them pleasantly instead of trying to kill them. The dragons slept more on stones than in the warm mists, grew lazy in a way that made the groundsmen cautious and the children bold. One day Drogon lifted a forefoot as a child ran beneath it and then set it down again with care. That story went from the yard to the kitchens and out again and made its own wind. The library room filled, slow and sober. Those who came with books came also with questions. Missandei kept the door and the ledger. Maester Coleman built cupboards that breathed like lungs. A woman from Gulltown wrote a treatise about ice. A smith from the Stormlands discovered a way to temper dragonglass with iron that made it less brittle. Gendry laughed and kissed the man hard on the face and went back to the forge with his mouth hurting and his mind racing. A boy from the Neck, skinny as a reed and twice as green, learned to heat stone without flame by digging channels that carried spring water first to boiling and then through piles of rocks laid with cunning. He showed Daenerys a basin where water steamed without smoke and said the word bath with the reverence of a convert. She sat in it and closed her eyes and felt for a moment as if the child who had hidden from masters in a city of stone had died a good death and given birth to someone who would not hide anymore. Cersei Lannister's last letters arrived at Winterfell 3 weeks apart, the first telling the North to send its dragons where they were needed, the second warning of treason, the third pleading for grain in elegant script. Sansa read them aloud to the council with a face like glass. Daenerys dictated an answer that used the word no with the patience of a teacher. The truth that hung unspoken between them all was simple. A South that had wavered while the North froze would now be permitted to wobble until it found balance. It would not be punished. It would not be fed at Winterfell's expense either. "We will send seed," Daenerys said finally. "We will send men who know how to build chimneys. We will not send dragons. The dragons stay." Drogon was beginning to claim his sky in any case. He would lift from the yard and make a pattern high over the castle, a circuit that traced the new towers and the old walls and then the winter town beyond. Rhaegal learned to land on Hearthguard's lip without breaking stone and then to bask with his injured wing fanned so that the membranous edge healed with the ugly, resilient beauty of things that are not meant to be pretty. They hunted along the broken river under the wall and brought back the charred, almost edible remains of aurochs and, once, an ancient stag that had never learned to fear flame. Men gathered and drew lots to butcher what could be butchered. The dragons watched, eyes half-lidded, indulgent as old gods. There were weddings, quiet ones, all heat and thin song and promises made with the comprehension that marriage in the North is as much about surviving a roof leak as it is about surviving a siege. There were funerals that took days to complete because grief has the particular stubbornness of a northern spring. There were births. There were the beginning of stories that people started telling with their hands around cups on the long nights that remained. The night the queen lit the trench with her own torch because the flint would not catch. The morning the dragons blew steam rings above the godswood. The day the free folk taught the unsullied the double sled trick and they raced down a hill screaming like boys. The hour Arya Stark stood on the wall and counted crows with an expression that made men step lightly. Jon and Daenerys did not marry at once. They stood together first. They learned the shape of shared command in a winter that did not end simply because an enemy had. They learned to give each other room and then to take it away when indulgence turned to mistake. They learned to fight without malice and forgive without forgetting. They learned to sleep with the certainty that someone else's breath can be a roof. When they did marry, it was in the godswood, with the old gods listening and Missandei reading words from no single book and Sansa standing to Daenerys right in a dress like the inside of a pearl. It was not a union that mended the South. It did not break it either. It made a piece of the world that was stronger for being a piece. The night after they took their vows, Daenerys woke to the sound of rain. Real rain, not sleet, not snow. It hit the eaves and ran in small quick rivers. She lay awake and listened and thought of other roofs in other cities and how none of them had been hers to keep. This one was. She reached for Jon in the dark and found him, and for a time they were only two warm bodies under a roof in a world that had not earned them and could not take them without a fight. Summer would not be summer in the way songs promise. The North summers are sharper, brief, treasured like peaches. The dragons grew sleek in that season and their shadows frightened fewer children. The towers breathed, pulsing heat through the yards in long sighs. The library filled. The forges sang. The road south that Daenerys had dreamed of showed itself in the first long caravan that came through Moat Cailin with axes laid across knees and babies on backs, prepared to work and learn and then choose to stay. They called what they were building a capital because no other word existed, but it was something else, something older. A hearth, not a throne. On a morning pale as unspilled milk, Daenerys stood on Hearthguard's crown and watched low. Harmless cloud brushed the new stone. Regal lay below, warmth puffing from flared nostrils in a rhythm that recalled tides. Beyond the walls, green showed in careful places where men had scratched it free of snow. Cabbages like dragon eggs, peas like beads. The world was making a case for itself. She breathed and thought of a child in a house of fear who had been told she was a queen because of blood and had not understood the word well enough to dispute it. She tasted steam and mint because Missandei had given her a sprig and told her to chew when she thought too hard. Jon came up behind her, his footfall now familiar as an old song. He set his hands on the parapet and looked out with her at what they had made. "It isn't a throne," he said. "No," she answered. "It's better." She did not argue. She let the silence fill with the drip and hiss and clink of a city that had begun under snow. She felt a dragon's breath at her back and the warmth of a man's arm at her side. She did not tell Daenerys this. She did not need to. "Your dragons will nest," Sansa said, eyes not leaving the road. "There will come a year when one of the eggs hatches." "I hope so," Daenerys said. "I hope not too soon. We have enough mouths." Sansa smiled. "That is a queen's answer. That is a woman's answer," Daenerys said. "Queensti. Women go on. Women count the grain." A wind from the sea found them then and brought with it salt and rumor. The rumor said, "A world is ending." The salt said, "It has ended before." The steam rising from the tower crowned them and was gone. Another veil lifted and replaced. The night the first egg cracked, they did not wake to roaring. They woke to a faint, steady tapping, a heartbeat that had learned to make itself known in the language of stone. Regal nosed the nesting bed in warm water and nudged a pale, veined thing that had been a possibility for months and was now a promise. Daenerys stood beside him, a hand to the great green ridge of his face. Jon came in quietly and did not speak, because some births are like prayers already answered and need no words. The egg split. A small head pushed, blinking. A thin, reedy sound. It would be a roar later, but for now it was an argument with the world. The tiny body slid free and was held by steam, as if warm air were hands. It opened its mouth and tasted the room. Its eyes were old because dragons are old the way rivers are old, even when they have just begun. Daenerys reached. Regal did not stop her. She touched the wet, shivering neck once and then twice and then drew back because love and heat are both kinds of burns. She looked at Jon and found him watching her with the expression she wore whenever she stood on Hearthguard and let the city's breath kiss her. She felt fear because to bring anything living into the world is to promise to hold it against winter and against your worst self, and fear is the first honest oath you swear in that moment. "We will need more wood," she said, and Jon laughed because it was a ridiculous thing to say and also the only thing that mattered. They laid the baby dragon beneath a vent and watched it fall asleep the way the tired fall asleep. All at once. Outside, the snow that still came in fits and starts met steam and turned to rain before it hit the yard. It tapped the stones in a small, pleased way. Somewhere, a man turned a valve and warm water moved where cold would have moved once. Somewhere else, a woman put a book back on a shelf and blew dust from the cover and remembered that dust is what the world turns into when it forgets to be water. Daenerys walked back into Winterfell before dawn and found the hall half-lit by embers that did not wish to die. She stood in the middle of the floor and turned slowly in place, as if she were a girl in a house that belonged to someone else and wanted to see how it would look if it were hers. It would not be hers. It never could be because Winterfell had an owner, and the owner had learned to share because sharing was not the same as losing. She lay down beside Jon just before the sky admitted it had begun to lighten. She closed her eyes. She dreamed of a road head-high with summer grass winding through snow, and of men and women who chose it, and of dragons who learned the shapes of clouds in every season and kept flying. She dreamed of a room that stayed warm when winter came back, and of girls who grew old sitting close to that warmth, telling a story that started. Once, a queen chose a hearth over a throne and taught the north to love heat. The hatchling's skin dried to the feel of lacquer over corded muscle, a tiny armor that shone when the steam swirled. When it woke with hunger that was more idea than pain, a seeking that made its narrow throat vibrate. Regal kept his heavy head low with a patience no one had ever asked of dragons, and so no song had been written to praise. Old, intelligent patience, the kind that sits before a closed door and waits for the latch to lift. Drogon watched from the shadowed arch like night watching a campfire. Jon fetched meat. Daenerys' hands were quick and gentle and ruthless, all at once. She fed the creature from fingers that had never known rings worth counting and knew already how to let go of anything that clung when it ought to chew for itself. The hatchling took her offered strips and tilted its wedge head and blinked as if trying to place her scent in the dictionary of its new world. It cooed with the dry, papery voice of a creature whose words would be thunder later. "What shall we call you?" Jon murmured, as if a name could be poured into that thin body and become marrow. Daenerys did not answer at once. She had named dragons before and learned that a name is a door you open for a living thing to walk through. You must be sure of the room on the other side. She watched the hatchling open its mouth at the rising steam, not to drink but to taste the air. Outside, rain made a soft talk against stone, a conversation between sky and work. "Skahaz," she said, and then shook her head because that was a memory of a man who had been brave and cruel in equal measure, and she did not want this creature to carry that balance. Not that. She stroked its neck and felt the small engine of its pulse. "Salher," she tried next, Valyrian roughened by northern cold. "Sun's breath." The hatchling gave a shiver that looked like a scent, or else Daenerys was a woman in love with a new life and saw a scent in every twitch. "Salher," she said again, and the name fell warm from her mouth and iced the air in front of her. Jon tasted it and nodded. They built a cradle of woven willow under the vent, lined it with furs nobody would miss, and some they would but did not complain about losing. Salher slept there as a flame sleeps under ash, visible only if you knew how to watch. Children from the winter town were allowed to look in pairs for a count of 20 heartbeats, neither more nor less, and to leave a token if they wanted the new dragon to remember them. The ledge filled with small treasures that would have been trash anywhere else. A twist of copper wire, a pebble with a white seam, a button carved clumsily into a wolf's head. Missandei kept a list of the names of givers. "When he is grown," she said, "and someone asks who loved him when he was small, we will answer with more than stories." The work of building went on with that new heartbeat inside it, as a woman goes on stirring the pot while a baby sleeps, measuring each movement against the breath behind her. Grey Worm trained a watch for the rookery, not to stop folk from looking, but to make sure looking stayed reverent. The Dothraki began a game played at twilight outside Warmwater. They sat in a circle and flicked bits of charcoal toward a chalk mark, wagering not in coin but in chores. 2 buckets carried for you tomorrow if you win, your place at the head of the line if you lose. The free folk joined and brought a rule nobody else knew. The loser must tell a true thing about the worst winter they had seen. The yard filled with cold, plain stories. A boy who had once set his hand in a stranger's pocket and found only a dead mouse. A woman who had eaten boot leather boiled 3 times until it wept a little fat. Daenerys listened, not because policy hides inside such tales like a rabbit in a hedge, though it does, but because the people she meant to keep alive were inside those tales and she needed to look them in the face. Sansa found the language of peace, the way she had once found the language of war, by memorizing the names of all the small moving parts. She could name the man at the gate whose wife's tears meant he was likely to take a bribe. She could name the woman in the kitchen who had never burned a single loaf even on days when bells shook the flour from the rafters. She drew roads in her head between such people and then made real roads with coin and timber and a sweet, remorseless insistence. The first stone mileposts in the north rose where she pointed a gloved finger. They did not carry a lion or a stag or a crowned maiden. They carried a wolf with a feather of steam above its back. Bran dreamed more or woke more inside dreams. No one could tell which, least of all Bran. He sent ravens to look for old trees with new sap rising, for weirs that had choked with ice and now coughed their first water back into the world. He followed rivers south and found men knee-deep in flooded fields cursing the winter and the king and whichever gods had made both. He came back to his body with his fingers cold and told Jon that the Green Fork would spill its banks in 2 days and wash away 3 fords. "Send boats," he said. "Send rope. Send men who can tie knots with numb hands." "We can spare them," Jon answered at once. And Sansa lifted a brow because once he would have asked how many and for how long and where they would sleep on the road. Now he knew without looking. In the evening she said so. He shrugged and said it was only because Davos had taught him the sums and Missandei had written them down so cleanly the numbers behaved like sheep. Davos's beard had gone whiter and his eyes had gone kinder, a trick few men managed together. He stood at the first of the new bridges when late melt came roaring down and watched it stand. He spat into the water and called it a ship. "Not a pretty one," he said to Gendry, who had come to see if his ironwork sang in a flood, "but one that'll get you to the other side. And that's a song worth learning even if no one writes it." "They will," Gendry said, and hefted his hammer with a pride that had made him a good smith and would not be allowed to swell him into a bad man. "They'll sing about how the bridge did not fall." "Most songs are about what didn't happen," Davos said. "That's why they sound like faith." Word from the south came as thin and as quick to turn as the spring sun. Cersei's strength frayed and then held and then frayed again. Gold cloaks took coin from any hand that offered it. A poor harvest threatened where a rich harvest had been presumed a birthright. Twice the envoy with the lion carriage returned and twice his letters were more polite and more desperate. A strange plate of compliments and demands from a city that did not understand that the winter which had been a myth for centuries had walked into their stories with iron-soled boots and sat at their tables uninvited. "We will send this," Daenerys said, and "We will not send that." Sansa watched for deception so quiet it might pass for habit. Missandei wrote the North's answers in a script so elegant even denial looked like grace. Among the northern houses, acceptance had the shape of a chessboard in the first moves of a new game. Pieces advanced to test, retreated to consider, advanced again. Lyanna Mormont did not bend. She walked beside Daenerys in the yard and told her 3 times that she would bite any hand that tried to pat her head. Daenerys laughed and said she had no plans to lose a finger. Lord Glover sent lumber and men and a grievance about the timber levy that made Davos close his eyes and count to 10 and then count backward. Wyman Manderly hosted a feast that used more salt than sense, and Daenerys ate every salted thing with gratitude because gratitude sometimes needs to be a performance so that others remember how it looks. That night, alone with Jon, she drank water until her belly sloshed and learned to hate salt in a new way. The first real scandal of the new hearth came in the shape of theft, which is how new capitals test themselves. Someone took a dragon's egg. It disappeared between twilight and dawn from warm water, from under the vent where the steam fell like a curtain. Riegel's roar woke the yard before the bells. The sound went up Hearthguard and shook stone dust into men's hair. Salher screamed in his small reed voice and Daenerys' heart went to a fist that could have cut through chain. Guards ran. Grey Worm's orders cut winter like a knife that remembered how to be summer. Missandei's ledger of comings and goings for the night opened in her hands as if it had been waiting to be asked. The Dothraki smelled for fear. The free folk looked for tracks that men wearing wealth have forgotten how to cover. Jon lifted Salher and set the hatchling under his cloak like a secret he knew. He could not keep for long but would keep for as many breaths as it took. The trail led not south but into Winterfell itself, into the stacked, breathing body of the old castle. That fact did not surprise Sansa, which made Daenerys want to trust Sansa more even while the urge to rage burned like swallowed coals. "In the north," Sansa said as they strode through the narrow ways that wind like veins between stone. "Betrayals are made close to home. We keep our enemies close because the weather and the wolves keep out the ones who live far. It isn't romance. It's logistics." They found the thief in the old granary that no longer held grain because new granaries had been raised along the steam channels and old. Deep rooms were being converted into workspaces no one had ever imagined would exist in the north. He was a man with calluses on his hands and scars on his knuckles, and the careful eyes of someone who had weighed the price of every cut of meat he had ever bought. He held the egg as if holding his first child. "Put it down," Daenerys said. He did not. He blinked into the lamplight like a mole finding himself up of ground for the first time. It is not a queen's thing, he said. It is not a lord's thing. It is a living thing. They ought not to keep it where anyone can take it if they are not watching. Anyone, Sansa repeated. Anyone, he said evenly. Me, or a richer man. Me or a crueler one. Me or someone who wants to break it to see if there really is a dragon inside. You were saving it, Missandei said quietly. She was not guessing. She was putting gentle words on a hard picture. I was making it not theirs, he answered. And the way he said theirs was the story of a whole life spent watching other hands scoop from his bowl. He raised his chin. If you mean to hang me, do it fast. I am not brave enough to be good at dying slow. You are from the Winter Town, Sansa said. He nodded. My father kept the third stall from the gate. He mended boots. He learned to mend people's feet when no one else would. He died in the last bad winter. I learned to eat slow and sleep light. He looked at the egg as a man looks at a fire he has made from his last scrap of wood. I thought if I could bring it to my house and keep my door, then perhaps it would love us. He shook his head before anyone else could. I know it is foolish. I know I have done a thing I cannot pay for. In Daenerys' mind, the room drew back until the egg shone like a coal. She was a girl again in a much, much warmer city, holding 3 eggs that had been her dowry and feeling in her bones the shift from ornament to destiny. She had not known it then, but the world had. The world had leaned closer to hear her breathe. Jon said nothing. He set Salher on his shoulder as if a second head had sprouted there, a myth made comic by tenderness. Daenerys stepped closer to the man. He did not flinch. She had loved the way men in Meereen had flinched. She had loved the way the fear in their eyes had fed a thing in her that had gone hungry for too long. That hunger was quieter in the north, where nothing ever truly filled you all the way. Perhaps that was good. Perhaps feeling the cold makes your appetite believe in the rest of the world. You will not be hanged, she said. Sansa's head turned a fraction. Enough for Daenerys to see approval and annoyance sit together like cousins in her eyes. You stole a thing that cannot belong to you, but you also called us to account without meaning to. If this egg could be taken by you, it could be taken by worse. I will not thank you for the theft. I will use the lesson. The man let out a breath that he had forgotten to put away. And me? He asked. What of me? You will work where you tried to steal, Daenerys said. You will sweep the rookery and mind the vents and keep the ledger for Missandei when her hand cramps. You will be watched. If you run, we will bring you back. If you try again, we will not be kind. If you stay and do the work and do not put your hand where it should not go, you will be permitted to say, when you are old, that you helped raise a dragon. He swallowed. What if I do not want to help you? You came because you wanted a thing that could not be yours. Sansa answered for her, soft without pity. Now you will do a thing you do not want for a house that is also not yours. That is how a people are made. The wanting and the not wanting together. He closed his eyes. Very well, he said, and Daenerys took the egg from his hands and felt, through shell and myth and heat, the exact weight of the choice she had made. They moved the eggs to a room deeper under warm water, where the steam was a hum and not a roar. Grey Worm posted a watch of Unsullied and of women from the Winter Town chosen by Missandei, which made some men snort until they saw the way those women stood. Rhaegal settled again with a sigh that smoldered from his throat. Salher fell asleep with his small jaw open and his tongue like a bright throne room rug. The man who had stolen the egg learned to sweep a dragon's shed scales without cutting his hands to ribbons, learned to read Missandei's hand and make his own legible, learned the smell of a vent that was too hot and would burn if not coaxed back. He did not want to love what he served. He loved it in any case. He did not say so. The ledger said it for him. The hours worked without being told. The careful notes about a hinge that squeaked. The 3 neat lines drawn under the day Salher first took meat from his fingers and did not nip by mistake. Dorne sent vines that curled under glass, and the first fat green grapes in the north swelled in a house that breathed like an animal. The children of the winter town called it the lung and dared each other to run from one end to the other without coughing in the moist heat. A maester from Old Town fainted the first time he went in and came to with his face damp and his ring cool as ice. He laughed and called himself a fool and went back in with a scarf over his nose and came out green but proud. A ravens man brought a message to the yard one afternoon when the steam was rising in pleased plumes that meant a good burn. He slid from his horse as if the saddle had tried to claw him and thrust the tube into Davos's hands like a man passing a hot coal. "From White Harbor," he said. "Bad." The message said, "Raiders on the coast." Not ironborn in the old sense, these came with no kraken painted, no banners at all. They burned and took and left the ash to explain them. They had shipcraft, and there is never a shortage of hungry men who can tie a knot and swing an oar. House Manderley had sent out men and come up short. The raiders had learned to run at the first sight of a wolf's banner and to come again at night. A salt-throated trick that had taught the North fear of open water even when the water did not carry winter in it. "Yara," Daenerys said, and Missandei was already unrolling a clean sheet of parchment. "We will ask her to hunt wolves in wolves' clothing." "You will ask," Sansa said, "and you will not offer her more than the hunting." "We will offer her a place to winter," Daenerys answered, "and timber, and hot baths. I am not stingy when a woman might do me a good turn and then stay to see what else can grow." "She is iron-born," Sansa said with a curl to her mouth that made her look for once not like a lady of anything, but plain old northern cleverness. "She will stay if the men she brings want to stay, and she will go if they do. That is all." Daenerys nodded. "Then we will make her men want to stay." "By paying them," Davos said. "Honestly, with coin that rings right. And by telling them they will not be told who to spit at," Jon added. "Ironborn are like wolves. They dislike being told where to piss." The answer came quick. Yara had already put to sea when the first word had gone out from White Harbor. There is a sort of grace in a woman who finds herself in the middle of a thing and does not look for a paper to give her permission. Her longships slid out of fog like teeth. The raiders were bold but not stupid, and boldness without stupidity sours into caution quickly on water. There were skirmishes, ugly, brief, wet. There were captains who showed their throats and asked only to keep their lives. There were boys of 12 who cried so hard when the first grappling hooks bit that the Ironborn who took them aboard lost interest in killing and found themselves telling the lads where to lay their hands and how to breathe when the oars start. A week later, a salt-stinking, smoke-blooming procession of new-made prisoners trudged through Winterfell's gate and learned that a queen can look a pirate in the face and see a fisherman if she chooses to. Some were sent to work on pipes. Some were sent to cut timber under the eye of a man from the neck who knew where trees want to stand and where they will fall happily. Some were sent back to sea with Yara, whose grin was a thin, satisfied knife. "You keep the sea's attention and it will behave for a while," she told Daenerys over a map that smelled like glue and lampblack. "It is like a spoiled child. It hates to be ignored. Give it chores." "We will give it men who do not know what else to do with their hands yet," Daenerys said. "We are building another sort of navy." Yara snorted. "A navy of bridges and pipes and baths. The songs of the North will be the dullest ever sung. They will be long," Missandei said, without looking up from the list she was making of the new mouths to feed and where their first beds would be laid. "And people will live to the end of them." Autumn wrote its first brown words across the trees and the dragons hunted farther, chasing flocks that drifted like torn cloaks across fields the color of bruises. Salher's wings lifted and stiffened and lifted, a child discovering shoulders. He climbed the stones of warm water and fell and climbed again until the skin over his ribs shone from effort. Rhaegal hissed gently when the young one got too near the edge. Drogon would belly crawl to the vent and take the steam into his mouth as if he were drinking, and then climb to the wall and pour it out, a hot ghost that made the sentries laugh even when they told each other they were still afraid. Jon took scouts along the King's Road not to scout for war but to map for weather. They counted low places where ice would sit and named new bynames for them. They measured the width of the road where it had been eaten by swamps and set men to lay brush there so that wagons would not sink to their axles. He came back with a face that had learned another kind of patience. not waiting for an enemy to show himself, but waiting for a mule to take a step and then another until you could see the town you had sworn to reach. I used to dream of battles, he told Daenerys that night in a bed that remembered their warmth now and gave it back with no embarrassment. Now I dream of dry boots. Dry boots win wars, she said, and he laughed because he had become the sort of man who believed it. Bran woke one morning with a taste of old wood in his mouth and told Sansa that a weirwood in the haunted forest had been cut. Not by the dead, he said. Not by hunger, by men. They are building a hall from it. Free folk, Sansa said. Yes, Bran said. And no. She tilted her head. No. Cersei sent a last envoy with eyes like the bottoms of wells. He stood in the yard and looked up at Hearthguard and Warmwater and at the new tower whose name had not been decided and at the dragons and at the STE. And that made halos above everything it touched, and his face did something like grief. A man who had believed in palaces seeing another sort of palace that made him understand why his had broken. He asked for wheat. He asked for builders. He asked for a royal wedding to bind heat and throne. He asked for men who could make the water run upward. He asked for everything because that is what a dying city asks for when it remembers it does not want to die. We will send wheat, Daenerys said. We will send 2 builders and 8 boys who know which end of a hammer is honest. We will not send dragons. We will not marry the South. We have married the North. She did not add, I have married a man instead of a city. She did not need to. The envoy heard it in the shape of her refusal. When he had gone, Jon said, one day a better hand will come out of the South, or a worse one. Either way, we will need to know what to do with it. We will look at it, Daenerys said, and then we will hold out our own. The naming of the 3rd tower became a merriment because the work had been hard and people needed to spend a whole night on something foolish. Lords gathered and cheated. Children whispered and swore each other to secrecy as if the naming were a heist. The free folk bet meat. The Dothraki bet hair. Gendry bet 3 days without touching his hammer and then nearly wept when he lost. Davos bet nothing. He stood and watched and learned which men cared more for the sound of their own words than for the place that would wear them. Sansa wrote a list of the worst names and put them in a drawer and took them out when she needed to laugh so as not to cry. In the end, Daenerys climbed a rungied ladder to hang the plaque herself. Steam Keep. It read in a hand that had learned to write with the same stubbornness that had taught itself to fly. People groaned, good-natured, brief. It was a plain name. It was accurate. No one would forget what the place was for. Accuracy had kept them alive. They could be pretty in summer when there was time to braid hair. A raven came from Deepwood Motte with a seal made from pitch. The letter was from a woman with a son who had wished to be an archer and had fallen from a tree and walked since then like a man whose feet belie him. He is no use to a lord who counts bodies, the mother had written. He is no use to a husband who counts steps. He is clever with his hands and his ears work like a fox's. We have heard that you have room for men who know how to be still. Missandei set the letter in front of Grey Worm. Grey Worm went himself to fetch the boy, and when he came back he set him to watching the valves in Steamkeep and to listening for the water's first wrong sigh. The boy became a man with a cane and away with the pipes that made them call him Listener, which was a better name than any of the handsome ones. He married a girl who cleaned the rookery and had hands that knew the patient's eggs demand. They had a daughter who bit everything when she teethed. Wood wool, a dragon's shed claw when no one was watching. And no one minded because children have to chew on a future to make their own teeth. Arya went south and west and came back with a map of lanes in her head and a pouch of spices that made the kitchen sneeze. She did not say where she had gone. She did not need to. She stood with Daenerys in the yard when the first frost took the last vegetables and said, people in White Harbor say your steam is witchcraft. People in the Barrowlands say it's a trick that will kill us all. People in the next say it is only a new sort of swamp that doesn't make you wet. People in the west say it is a way for the north to feel important. What do you say? Daenerys asked. Arya shrugged. I say it makes old women sit longer with their feet in warm water, and that makes them kinder for the rest of the day. I say it makes boys who would have stolen bread learn to carry buckets instead. I say it makes the air look like the gods are always talking. I like that. Daenerys laughed. Then we will keep the gods talking. Winter thought about returning. It tapped again at the windows and found the rooms warmer than it remembered. It sulked and tried the chimneys, and found hands waiting at the dampers to greet it. Saw her grew a handspan and then another. He learned to climb to a low ledge and fling himself into the air with the comic, heartbreaking bravery of a small thing who has decided its body should obey the sky. He fluttered. He thumped. He learned how not to break his face. Regal kept his wings steady for him to practice balance and snarled once when a boy laughed too loudly at a fall. And the boy's laughter turned into a promise not to laugh that way again. Drogon found a place outside the wall where the ground bubbled in little boils, the last of the hot springs the builders had not yet used, and lay there, stretched like a black river that had decided to be still. His eyes slitted with the boredom of a satisfied god. Bran came to the hall one noon with snow caught in his hair the way white catches in the beard of a man who has drunk milk. He said, "I have seen the children," and no one else in the room laughed. He did not mean children. He meant the ones who had been in the north before men had learned to lie about who was first. They stood at the edge of a pool where a tree grows through water, he said. They did not look at me. They looked at the steam. They do not understand it. They are not angry. They are curious. That is a sort of gentleness we should honor. How? Sansa asked. Bran looked at Daenerys. Do not put stone where the trees breathe. We have not, Daenerys said, and it was true. She had told the Masons from the first. Nothing in the Godswood is to be touched without Sansa's voice. Now she told them more. Nothing with roots is to be shut up or smothered. The dragon towers would have their stone bellies. The ground would have her trees. Bran smiled. At a little. The children did not write letters. They wrote in the way ravens turned when they flew, in the way a fox paused at the steam's edge and tested the air. In the second winter, not as cruel as the first but bitter enough to make men's lips crack in the same patterns. A boy came from the south with a tin whistle and a song that made the Dothraki cry. He had learned it in a stable and brought it north because songs go where heat goes. He stood in warm water and played, and the steam took the high notes and made them sound like a woman laughing far away. The boy looked like he was about to faint from happiness. Daenerys gave him a bath and a bed and a place near the main vent to play at the hour when men's backs ache. He became a musician of valves. He wrote a tune with holes in it that the water filled at the right moment and made into something no one had heard. Cersei Lannister died in the Red Keep, not by dragon or by Valyrian steel or in the arms of a brother. She died by the slow arithmetic of drought and riot and debt catching up with a woman who had never learned that water and bread and patience have more crowns between them than any diadem. The city did not explode. It sagged into the next thing, which is the most frightening and honest way a city can behave. A man with a forgettable face and a talent for not dying stepped into the space she left and called himself Hand for a boy who had the grace to look tired rather than cruel in his portraits. They sent an envoy north who did not ask for dragons. He asked for teachers. He asked if boys from the guilds could come and learn to bend pipe without kinking it and read a ledger without lying to it. He asked if the new bells could be cast with less blemish. He asked, with a humility that made even Sansa put down her armor for an hour, if the North would teach the South how to breathe without setting itself on fire. We will, Daenerys said, and where another woman would have added a price, she added a condition. Send girls. They sent girls. They came wrapped in the noise of the South, clutching skirts that had not been meant to see snow. They learned to hold a hammer with mittens on. They learned to keep their hair from steam. They learned that a queen will kneel to show you how to lift without breaking your back. They learned to swear in 3 northern dialects, each more satisfying than the last. When the first of them went back to the city with hands that could tell when a line was about to burst just by laying a palm to it, she took with her a memory of steam on her face that would never leave and a story about a dragon who had let her scratch his chin once as if she were a cat with no fear. Jon climbed the wall again because memory is a thing that grows dull if you will not sharpen it. He stood on the top and let the wind try him and looked north where the ice scars had not melted and would not in his lifetime, and south where the world had learned to move water in new ways. He thought of the brotherhood he had known up there, and of the things they had failed, and of the things they had done anyway that had saved lives. He thought of his father and of his father's honor, as if it were a road you walk that sometimes runs out of stones and forces you to put your feet on mud. He came down a day later with cheeks bit open by the cold and a smile that was a private thing. Daenerys kissed the cracked places and called him a fool, and then called him brave, and then called him hers, and each name fit. Salher took his first true flight at dusk in the second winter, when the air is often as still as guilt. He climbed in a series of ungainly leaps that made even the most pious in the yard mutter prayers they had forgotten. He found a layer in the air where his little wings met a kindness, and he slid there as if a hand guided him. Regal rose close, a father or an uncle or something. Dragons are that men have forgotten how to name. Drogon kept low with a watchfulness that made Jon's throat sting. Salher curved above Warmwater and above Hearthguard and above Steamkeep and then above Winterfell itself, wings whirring like a giant moth's heartbeat. He croaked a sound that was not yet a roar and threw a line of thin flame toward the sky. The flame went out quick. The cheer did not. The cheer spilled from the yard and out into the winter town and up the road toward the old mileposts and down again into the gods' wood, where the red leaves breathed it in and gave back nothing because trees do not clap. They named a new street that day, not for a lord, but for a man with a cane who had listened to pipes until he could hum their language better than most men hum lullabies. They named it Listener's Lane. The name made the maesters sniff. It made the women in the baths grin. It made the children run it over their tongues like sugar. Grey Worm and Missandei sat one night at a rough table, fingers touching the way people touch when they have survived one world and agreed to sit down in another. He had learned to smile with his eyes more than with his mouth. She had learned to sleep with her door unlocked without waking in the middle of the night to check it. "I wanted to go to Noth," he said. He had not spoken that sentence in months. It had felt disloyal to a winter that had made room for them. "I wanted you to go," she said. "I wanted to sit beside the sea and listen to the wind say my mother's name. And now," she gestured at the ledger open between them, at the column of names under the heading girls sent south to teach, at the column of names returned, at the small, ink-smudged heart Missandei had drawn next to a child called Thistle because the girl had come back and brought a dozen boys who could tie sailors' knots with their eyes shut. "And now," Grey Worm said. "And now," she agreed. "Perhaps we will go when we are old and take baths every day because we do not have to count the firewood anymore. Perhaps there will be a room there that smells of mint because a woman in the north taught me it helps when you think too hard." He reached across the ledger and closed her hand inside his. "There will be a room," he said, "because we will build it wherever we go." They were not without enemies. A man who had lent money to boys in the winter town for 20 years at a rate that made those boys old before their time found that his coin had fewer hungry mouths. He paid 3 thugs to pick fights in the baths and call the dragon towers witchcraft. He paid a woman to say her child had been burned by steam. He paid a man to draw a dragon with a child's head in charcoal on a new stone. The thugs slipped and slid and found themselves ejected by 2 old ladies who had used the baths twice and had more right to the place than men with coin ever will. The woman he paid had a baby who had indeed a red patch on its leg, and Missandei went herself to look and said, "This is a rash from wool. We will give you linen," and then made sure linen was there in a chest for any mother who needed it and would ask. The man who drew the dragon with the child's head was a good artist, and Gendry hired him to paint signs for the forges with red wolves and gold hammers that made the yards look like a fair. It is difficult to keep an enemy when the world keeps offering him honest work. Another sort of enemy moved quieter. He wore a maester's ring and had learned to talk without moving the corners of his mouth. He told men in Whitetown that dragonglass blunted more quickly than iron. He told men in Deepwood that steam breeds sickness in the lungs. He told women in Barrowton that a queen who will not kneel to a southern boy will one day ask your granddaughter for a kiss, and that girl will be unable to say no. Sansa listened to the lies and did not send men with blades. She sent boys with notebooks and questions. The maester discovered that a lie is like a woven thing. It snags and unravels when children ask it to hold their weight. He left the north and wrote a book in Old Town about the northern folly. Missandei read it and made a list of the parts that were wrong and laughed, and then laid the book down on a shelf where anyone could see it, and beside it put a ledger filled with the names of babies who had lived through the last winter and the weight of bread rationed when there had been less and the number of pipes repaired in the last freeze. "Let him have his book," she said, and Sansa nodded because the best way to answer a lie is to keep living. A letter came from the Vale signed by a lord who thought himself handsome. He said, "We hear of your towers. We hear of your baths. We hear of your books. We hear you have no king over you, only a queen and a lady and a man who is also a king but walks like a steward." The letter pretended to be praising while setting out small insults like nails on a road. Sansa read it aloud and then set the paper down and said, "We will invite him to sit in a bath and speak of trade. If he will not sit, if he will stand in his boots and sweat, we will know he is not able to learn. If he will sit and listen, we will know he may yet become someone we can bear." He came, he sweated, he listened, he left with a respect he did not know how to hide. Daenerys and Jon walked the winter town in the evenings when the roofs smoked like contented beasts. They learned the names of dogs because dogs will tell you the truth about their houses faster than any man. They bought hot oatcakes wrapped in cloth and ate them while the steam kissed their ears and the wind nipped their cheeks and the dragons made silhouettes like mountains that had learned to move. They stopped on Listener's Lane and listened to the water speak in its new tongue and did not pretend to understand all of it. They went home to Winterfell through the gate where 2 wolves were carved and wondered when, if ever, they would stop feeling like visitors at a friend's house who had given them the spare bed with the best blankets. In the 3rd spring, seed lay in the ground waiting for its chance the way men lie under blankets waiting for love. The glass houses had a smell now that made southerners shake their heads and say it felt like midsummer even with their breath fogging before their faces. The first peaches ripened under glass, and Daenerys stood and bit one and the juice ran down her wrist and she laughed because tears and laughter have much the same taste if you are truly grateful. She sent a basket south with a letter that said, "Taste this and tell me again that the North is only a story told to frighten children." The letter came back stained with juice and the word sorry written 3 times by 3 different hands, which is as close as a city can come to kneeling. The new weir on the white knife broke because the first attempt at anything is a boy with big hands and no practice. The flood swarmed and men ran and women ran and the dragons rose and blew steam into smoke to keep men from running where the water would take them. The weir was patched and then rebuilt with a curve that learned from the river instead of telling it what to do. The curved weir hummed when it was full the way a great cat hums when it is pleased. Listener heard it and hummed back and then went home to a wife who told him he smelled like river and he smiled as if that were a crown. The man who had stolen the egg came to Daenerys one morning and put his hands on the table with the palms up. "They are clean," he said. "I wash them in the water that drips from the vent because the water is warmed by the same thing that warms the egg, and I decided that was right." She nodded. "What do you want?" "I want to hold him," he said, not looking left or right as if asking for anything less would have made him a liar. Once, Salher was no longer a thing any hands could hold. He was a sleek, stubborn curve of muscle and heat, a promise with claws. He would let Regal bump him with a head as I. If he were still small, he would let Drogon blow warm air at him in a game that made the yard happy. He would let Missandei touch the ridge at the back of his skull and lower his eyes as if the world were being brushed. He would not let many others near. Daenerys took the man to warm water and set him where the steam fell thickest. "If he chooses," she said. "Not if you choose." The man nodded. He did not reach. He stood as if a god had walked into a room and he had remembered just in time not to stare. Salher came with the sly, delighted curiosity of young things, all shoulder and awkward tail, and sniffed. He puffed steam back at the steam, then put his tiny tongue out and tasted the air near the man's hands. The man did not flinch. Salher put his jaw against the open palms and put a little weight there, a courtesy so enormous it would have taken a smaller heart than Daenerys's to bear it. The man shut his eyes and made a noise like a man who has swallowed grief and found it was warmth. He did not weep. He stood until Salher moved on, and then he opened his eyes again and walked away without another word. Because sometimes a whole life's worth of words is one brush of a dragon's jaw in your open hands, and you must keep quiet to hear it echo. On Midsummer Day, which is more a wish than a day in the north, Jon and Daenerys took a party to the wall and walked under it into the ruin of the old ways. They found bones where bones should not be and burned them on a pyre with words that belonged to neither new God nor old but to the living. They stood in a valley of stone that had learned to speak, and Bran said the children were near, and the wind lifted and dropped and did not show them. They came back with pockets full of pebbles whose only magic was the shape of the hands that had held them. They did not count their enemies and find none. They did not count their friends and find only saints. They found men who needed to be told the same things 3 times and women who needed to be given power in rooms where men had never seen a woman sit, and boys who believed dragons belonged to them because nothing had told them they were ordinary yet. They found girls who drew pipes on every scrap of paper they found and made the bends too sharp because they did not yet know how to coax the world into curves. They found death in the evenings in the form of old men who had kept the North alive with their hands and now wanted to sleep. They found birth in the mornings in the form of girls who could howl like wolves and boys who could hum like valves. They found grief that does not require an enemy and joy that does not require permission. The South chafed less. It learned to stretch. The first bathhouse in King's Landing that heated itself with a dragonless engine opened to a crowd who had come to sneer and stayed to soak. The Bread Guild sent a letter saying, "Our ovens work better now that the smoke finds its road." The Gold Cloaks learned that a city with fewer nights of smoke choking the alleys has fewer murders. A boy who had stolen 6 purses before he was 12 learned to read the numbers on a gauge and stopped stealing because the red needle gave him the same thrill without anyone weeping afterward. A girl who had been told her hands were only for washing other people's feet built a small stove for her mother that boiled water without making the room smell like a funeral. People lived in the shape of the North's work without ever seeing the towers. That is the best sort of empire, the one that does not know its name. Salher grew, and when he screamed for the first time like a true dragon, the sound shook frost from the shadowed corners of the godswood and made the wolves lift their heads and think of a winter long ago and a fire long ahead. He learned to wheel above the road and cast his shadow across men who had not learned to love dragons yet, and then to pull it away before fear could ripen into hate. He learned to land on Steam Keep without rattling every valve. He learned to sleep with his jaw on Regal's foreleg. He learned to lunge at Drogon and be thrown head over tail into a snowbank and come up snorting and delighted and chastened in a way only love can teach. Daenerys learned to sleep without waking to the idea that a city was burning because she had not been cruel enough. She learned to wake to the smaller panic that a pipe had burst and the old women's baths were cold. She learned to sit in a meeting in which the most important argument was about the placement of a drain, and to treat it with more care than a treaty. She learned to be a wife in a house that had learned to accept her without kneeling to her, and a queen in a place that had chosen not to be a kingdom in the way men in books mean it. Jon learned to live in a world where his sword was a tool among other tools and not the single instrument by which songs are written. He learned to count boots and bread with the same energy he used to count blades. He learned to laugh when Salher tried to steal his glove because dragon humor is sometimes a matter of theft. He learned to listen when Sansa said, "No, not today," and to obey not because she was right, though she often was, but because he had asked her to tell him when to stop. On the 5th winter's first night, the aurora marched like 1,000 banners over the north while warm rain fell into a bowl outside Steam Keep and hissed as if telling a secret. Daenerys and Jon stood on Hearthguard's crown with fur about their shoulders and watched the sky tell its old story in new colors. The dragons lifted their heads and watched too, not because they cared for stories, but because they understood when the world made a display and they were creatures of display. Salher opened his mouth to taste the green light and found it cold and harmless. He looked genuinely insulted, and Drogon put a paw gently on his back to remind him that not every glory is a meal. "Do you ever think of what we did not do?" Jon asked, soft, as if he thought the lights would vanish if he breathed wrong. "I think of the city I did not burn, and I am glad," Daenerys said. "I think of the throne I did not claim, and I feel nothing at all. I think of a girl who had only 3 eggs for dowry, and I want to tell her that one day she will stand in a place where winter's breath turns to steam and the world will call it hers though she does not own it, and she will be all right." He nodded. "I think of a boy who wanted to be a hero and fell in love with the shape of the word, and then married a woman who taught him to love the work instead." He smiled. "He is all right too." They held each other until the green fell away and the sky went black and full of old, indifferent stars. Steam breathed up around their boots. The yard below clicked and sighed and ticked like a creature settling into sleep. Somewhere an old woman stood from a bench in warm water and said, "Well, I never," and then, "Ha!" and went home to a bed under a roof that had learned to be warm. When the spring after that came, the first small birds nested in the vents despite everyone's best efforts to convince them the place was not a tree. They made a mess. They thrilled the children. Listener devised caps for the vents that shook a little when a bird tried to land and shivered it off without scaring it. The birds moved to Steamkeep's eaves. They learned to like the syllable steam, chewing it like a seed. They learned to weave wolf hair into their nests. They learned to ignore dragons the way village dogs ignore royalty, politely until a scrap falls. A man from Bravos came to see the towers and took out a wax tablet and made notes and tried to remember not to show that he thought northerners were barbarians. He asked many questions about water and pipes. He asked none about men and women, because Bravosi are cowards about the human heart. They hide it behind manners. He went home to a city that had learned to make fog a friend and wrote a book that said, "I saw the North's breath and it did not stink." Northerners pretended the line was an insult and read it aloud to each other with pride. A boy from the Riverlands came and learned to stir molten glass without losing his eyebrows and wrote his mother, "I am alive and warm and sometimes I sit in a pool so hot I come out red as a boiled lobster and no one laughs." She framed the letter, and when the house caught fire one summer she carried it out first and laughed like a madwoman when someone asked why she had left the money. "Because money burns," she said, "and words do not. I can find more coin. I cannot make my boy's hand write those words again." When the 10th winter came meaner than memory, because winters are proud and will not be outdone by stories, the towers were ready. The weirs sang low songs and the pipes knocked like knuckles telling jokes in the dark. The baths filled and emptied. The library did not mildew because Maester Coleman had warred against damp the way other men war against godlessness and won every skirmish that mattered. The dragons flew their circuits and found the weather and made paths through it for men's minds to follow. Babies were born and old men died and lovers fought and made up and the bread rose when the cooks told it to and sometimes when they forgot to tell it. On the first night of that 10th winter, a stranger walked into the winter town with a pack on his back and a story in his mouth that he had found in the far south. He told it for an oatcake and a bed beside a stove, and the story was this. Once there was a queen who chose a hearth over a throne, and the world burned less and breathed more, and though her dragons frightened children her baths soothed them, and though her husband had a sword he used his hands more, and though her sister in power wore iron beneath velvet she laughed sometimes, and though the winter came angry it always left angry too, and what matters is who learns how to be alive in the middle. No one asked the stranger for a source. They had steam and bread and a line of men at the door who had come to see if there was room. There was, because the work of making room had not been a war. It had been the daily chore of people who decided to love heat. Daenerys listened to the story at the hall's edge and looked across at Jon, who was talking to a boy with red hands about why pipes are like arteries and you must bleed them when they are clogged or you will have a stroke. She looked at Sansa, who was telling Gendry that he should sit sometimes and learn to enjoy the way a chair holds you. She looked at Missandei, who was teaching a girl to write her name and make it as long as she wanted. She looked at Grey Worm, who was making a cat purr by scratching its chin in precisely the right place. She looked at Regal, who was sleeping with his mouth open, as if he had decided to swallow the steam because he wanted the smell of mint in his dreams. She looked at Drogon, who was awake and watching the door as if he were the door. She looked at Salher, who was awake and watching Drogon and learning the art of being a door with a dragon's patience. She sat down. She took off her gloves. She put her hands flat on the table as if on a map and asked the air what road they ought to build next. The steam lifted and curled and made its low, kind talk. The answer was not a throne. It was a roof to mend, a pipe to lay, a book to copy, a baby to feed, a pool to scrub, a law to write, a laugh to share. It was work. It was heat. It was breath. It was a life and she was living it.